Since it's 9:34, which is always the beginning of an adult ed session, why would we want to change tradition? We'll start right now. And we're so glad you're here. We suspect that more will come in. We're really appreciating your flexibility in using the sanctuary space as our adult faith formation, is what we're saying, class. Of course, we have no other options because there are no other spaces we can use, so this is it, and this is good. I want to do a brief introduction to our speaker, our teacher, our lecturer and facilitator of this wonderful series we're calling Reimagining Well-Being. This will go for 7 sessions. We'll take a break on October 31st on Reformation Sunday, but 7 sessions running through November 21st, I believe. This is Reverend Dr. Jason Whitehead. Jason is a Presbyterian minister and also a professor of pastoral theology, or was a professor of pastoral theology at Iliff School of Theology. And now Jason can tell you more, but he is a therapist and coach and just helping people get healthy. You do stuff, and he writes and does all sorts of good stuff. So we are so glad you're here. Thank you, Jason, for this great idea, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you. And thank you, Clover and Ian and Jason and all who have helped kind of facilitate getting this space going. And thank you all for being here, whether you're kind of watching this live. We're also recording, and I think some of this will be played out in various places throughout our time together, whether it's at a dinner club or supper club, or some of the other spaces that we're having. So I know this is the first time y'all have had adult education since 18 months, almost 2 years ago. And what an 18 months it's been. Public health decrees, frustration, grief, loneliness, remote learning and working, mask fatigue, separation, racial injustice, no hugs, no handshakes if either one of those was your thing, burnout, conflict, political changes, and so on and so forth, all magnified by sometimes our imagination. Many of us are exhausted, aggrieved, and some of us are even traumatized by this experience. We're leaving jobs at record paces. Some of us are questioning priorities. Some of us are just trying to survive. It's a time when what we know is fleeting at best, and what endures is difficult to ascertain. But all that said, we're here now. And whether it's because of the habit that we have that we want to return to, or it's because there's something in person and you would have shown up for anything, regardless of what was being taught, or the idea of reimagining your and our well-being is something that interests you, I'm glad you're here. And I'm glad you're taking part in this. So before we dive into the topic today, and Clover alluded a little bit to what was going on, I thought it might be helpful to provide a little context for the overall what we're doing. The genesis of this project came because I did a 3-minute video for the Board of Pensions in the Presbyterian Church around mental health in May. And Clover and I met outside and had some good conversations this summer to talk through what does life look like now? Because life changes and life is different in these spaces. And so it was a wonderful co-creative process of conversation and back and forth and figuring out and hoping and imagining and dreaming. And so we came up with what you have in front of you. These first 2 weeks, we're going to kind of spend getting a common language developing a common set of ideas or developing a common story in this space. And this is important because in order to have conversation, we have to take a similar journey, even if we don't take it down the exact same road. Having a common language allows us to communicate, to ask questions, to seek direction or discernment, and it also helps us develop community. It gives us a way to share with others what we're experiencing as well as how we want to respond to what we're experiencing. So much of our energy today is spent on wanting to be heard, wanting to be seen, and wanting to be understood. Gary Friedman, who was the originator in the late 70s of divorce mediation, he was a lawyer who was tired of seeing all these acrimonious cases, talked about and developed a process whereby people were sitting in the same room and listening to each other. The process wasn't about changing their mind, but it was about finding ways to be seen and heard. And what he learned over his time of doing this with couple after couple is that, and the way that he put it is, being understood is more important than money or property. It's more important even than winning. And so to develop a common language, a common way of talking about this particular series is that way of being seen and heard and understood. All right, so we're going to spend 2 weeks. Today we're going to talk about imagination, and we'll do something with crayons and the paper that you have here in just a little while. We're going to talk about imagination today, and next week we're going to talk about well-being. So those are going to be our 2 kind of grounding Sundays. And then after that, there'll be some other speakers. Dr. Kelly McMullen, is going to come here and talk about physical well-being, fitness, and health. And remember, we're going to be looking at this from 5,000 feet, not 50 feet. And that's, again, where common language matters and common language helps, is because you have to translate from 5,000 to 50 feet. What does physical health mean to you? And what does physical fitness mean to you? And what does physical well-being mean to you? And it'll be the same when we talk about spiritual. So Dr. Kathy Kelsey from ILIF will be here to talk about those capacities within the spiritual realm to some extent. And then I'll be back with you for the following 2 Sundays to talk about mental and social well-being. And then we'll kind of adapt and figure out what the last Sunday is, but we kind of want to be able to tie it up in a pretty bow at the end of all this. And so we'll have a final Sunday where we'll just kind of talk about what it means to integrate all of this, because this is what was important to me, and what I hope that you'll see at the end of all this is that everything flows into everything else. Your mental well-being impacts your physical well-being, impacts your capacity to connect socially, and impacts how you feel about your relationship to God. And all of those things affect other things. Your relationship with God impacts your mental well-being, impacts your capacity to feel like you can show up in church and be yourself and listen and be a part of things, which impacts your ability to breathe, which impacts tension in the body and our ability to navigate difficult and new spaces. So all of this is with an eye towards integrative wholeness or well-being at the end of our time. And so let's just jump right in to certain things. So I'm going to say, I don't think I've ever told an adult what a wonderful imagination they have. I've told them, that was really creative what you did, but it's always in the context of output, of productivity. That was really creative how you put those ideas together. Or that was a creative question, but I've never in my memory said to an adult, you really have an amazing imagination. We've told kids those things. I've told parents of kids that their kids have amazing imaginations. but I've never done, and I've never heard it said to me as well, which makes me wonder to some extent, where does that cutoff happen? When do we stop telling adults, people, that their imagination matters? In workplaces, we'll go on retreats. We'll go on retreats to strategize. We'll go on retreats to develop possibilities. We won't even say, we're going to go play with our imaginations. Everything at some point shifts to a space of productivity, a space of output, rather than a space of how are we creating, co-creating, building ideas together. And so the funny thing is that we all use our imaginations daily, every single day. Every time you tell a story to someone else, you are using your imagination. And we'll talk a little bit about where that comes from in a moment. But the idea is that imagination is one of the primary things about humanity that separates us from other species. The capacity to wonder and think about the future and develop possible alternatives is one of our defining hallmarks as far as how we understand the research of imagination going. And so I'm getting ahead of myself, and so let's play with crayons for a moment. So if you have a piece of paper and find a crayon, and hopefully this is okay, find a hymnal if you want something hard to write on, or a Bible or whatever it is. Make sure you have those in front of you. And so what I want you to do is, I'm going to time us here, and I want you to spend 30 seconds. While you're rustling to get the crayons out, I'm going to set my timer here. So we're going to spend 30 seconds doodling on your piece of paper. Whatever you want, whatever color you want to use, whatever it might be. And your time starts now. Just whatever you imagine you want to put on that piece of paper. And 30 seconds is not very long because your time is up. What I would ask that you do is hand your piece of paper to someone near you. Just exchange papers with them. All right, and when you get someone else's paper, you have another 30 seconds to add to their drawing. Whatever you want to draw, whatever you want to add to it. It's a little easier when we have tables, I know, but this is what we have right now, and this is what we'll do. So just add to it. Add to whatever is on the piece of paper in front of you right now. Use your imagination. All right, I'm going to ask you to stop and then exchange it with a different person. Again. So make sure you don't have your paper back. All right, on your mark, get set, go. All right, stop. One more time. One more time. Now, the difficulty in this is going to be finding your original paper at the end of all this. All right, 30 more seconds. Did you lose a paper? I will say, if you're at home or if you're doing this in a different way or if you're by yourself, you can close your eyes for 10 seconds and rotate the page 90 degrees, and then start drawing again is another way to do this exercise. All right, that's our time. Now, I'd love to say, find your original drawing, but I forgot to tell everybody to put their names on it. So that may be more difficult. And maybe that's something you can do after we're done here as we go along. But the idea is this is how imagination works in the mind. Okay? We start with a particular idea or start with a particular picture in mind, and then it gets connected to another idea, another shape, another form, another color, whatever it might be. And then the new image or picture gets another idea grafted on top of it. And so imagination kind of cascades. So if I told you, to picture right now a purple elephant riding an electric scooter down the street, you could do that because you have certain reference in your mind. You have a reference for what an elephant is, for what a scooter is, for what a street is, for what the color purple is. And your mind can build that picture. You've never seen a purple elephant riding an electric scooter down the street, and if you have, that's a conversation for another day. But the idea is that we can picture it. We can create that picture in our mind. And so imagination connects memories or ideas in new ways. It overlaps with our capacity to dream. There's a lot of research that's done around dreaming and then daydreaming, as well as just the capacity to access our imaginations. But this is why imagination becomes important, is that capacity to figure out something new. And we are in a time where everything is new. Times of uncertainty beg, to some extent, us to figure out how do we live and breathe and become and move in those spaces. And this is a time of imagination for us as a church, for us as individuals, for us as families, whatever that might be. All right, so let's take a few minutes and take every bit of wonder out of imagination for a moment. Instead of thinking about it as some creative enigma that other people have, I want to talk about where the capacity for imagination comes from. And so we're going to dive into brain science here for a little bit. We're going to talk about 3 particular things in our brains that have to do with imagination. We're going to talk about neuroplasticity, we're going to talk about memory, and we're going to talk about emotions. So here's the simple case that I want to make. We need our imaginations. We need to cultivate and practice and utilize the capacity to dream, daydream, follow rabbit trails, and imagine. Our bodies and brains were meant to imagine, to make connections, to co-create novel ways of thinking and being in the world. And just as we are constantly experiencing change, we need to constantly amend, adapt, and shift our mental models of the world and of who we are. It's not just interpretation outward, it's interpretation inward as well. The central premise of these series of classes is that each new reality we experience requires new ways of imagining who we are and how we choose to be together. And I know we're tired of adapting. We're exhausted from the shift in rules and regulations, and for the most part, we crave some certainty in the midst of all the ambiguity. I'm there with you more often than I want to be. And I also believe that God is with us in those moments as well. And it's this capacity to imagine that becomes central to how we experience God in a rapidly changing and evolving world. So the mechanics of imagination are important because if this capacity to imagine is ingrained in who we are, then it's imperative that we pay attention to, cultivate, and utilize our imaginations regularly. Imagination should live at the core of our faith and life together. It should call, pull, lure us into new ways of seeing and interacting together in the world. It's when the world becomes fixed that we start running into problems. Some of the biggest fights we have are about competing expectations of certainty. We desire for God to act predictably, even as we run up against the new things God does every day. We're a lot like Jonah, sitting outside of Nineveh pouting because God didn't destroy it. We aren't willing to use our imaginations to allow for a different outcome, assuming that what was promised first is the only thing that can be delivered later. So let's get into some of these mechanics for a moment. About 20 years ago, scientists told us that at a certain age, your brain stopped making connections. It stopped evolving, it stopped developing new pathways. What a difference 20 years makes. What we know today is that the brain continues to make neural pathways and prune unused pathways constantly. This is what neuroplasticity in general is. It's the ability for the brain to rewire itself based on the way that neurons fire together. There's an adage in neuroscience that neurons that fire together wire together. So what this means is that when something gets connected, they start to build a pathway. You can think about it starting out like a game trail. As animals start to move towards water, a little trail begins to form, and then humans come behind that trail and they make a hiking trail out of it. And then if the hiking trail is amenable, it becomes bigger and becomes a carriage road, and the carriage road becomes a car road, and the car road becomes a superhighway. This is how our capacity for our brains to build pathways happens. The more we use it, the bigger it gets, the faster it gets. So that image of a purple elephant riding on a scooter down the street, your brain now has connections between various points that hold ideas of color, ideas of animals, shapes. It now has a rudimentary connection in there that has this pathway with that image in it. You're welcome, by the way. You can have that. That's a gift from me to you for the rest of the day here. But the interesting thing is that should you continue to think about it, and maybe even come up with a story about why that elephant's riding the scooter, the neurons would start to fire faster as the connection becomes more and more kind of reified in the brain. Never think about it again, and that connection goes away, and that energy gets put into different parts or different ideas or different things that we're working with. But when we think about it, the brain is a pretty amazing organ that's just ensconced in an armor of bone and flesh. And the fact that we're constantly building these pathways and pruning old ones means that we're never the same person. We are similar, and our memories make sure of that, but we are never the same person when we enter a space. When we tell stories, we never tell the same story twice. Our imaginations make sure of that. We don't recall memories like a movie. Our brain is not like a computer. It's more like watching improv. There's a certain set of stipulations, there's a certain set of stories, but it's always filling in the gaps with things we believe or connections we're making. Which is one of those fascinating things about us, is that we think we're the same person, or we think we tell the same story, or we think we're consistent, and we're not. You know, I could tell a story about my childhood, and then come back next week and be asked to tell the same story, and I'm going to remember something different about it. I'm going to fill in the gaps a little bit differently. Somebody's going to come up to me and say, I had a similar story to that, and you know what? Some of that's going to get incorporated into my story. Because we like for things to be cohesive. And so the story wants to have a beginning and a middle and an end. But we only know little parts of it. There's some out there who would say we know like 40 to 60% of an experience. Everything else is made up. Everything else is our meaning of the experience, our beliefs about the experience. Someone else's experience that they told us they had that was very similar to our experience. And so this constant making and remaking of ourselves means that we have to use our imaginations. And so that leads us to that second kind of piece. So our brains are constantly rewiring itself, is memory. So again, purple elephant on the scooter. Without things to refer to, the image doesn't make sense. Okay? If you've never seen an elephant before, if you don't know what a scooter is, you can't imagine the scenario. If you don't even know what a street is, you can't imagine that scenario. And what's even more interesting about that is that we probably all, should you have created a picture of that, created a different sized elephant, a different shade of purple, a different type of scooter, and a different street they're going down. I had a big dark purple elephant on a lift scooter riding down Montview. That was my image when I wrote this. Your mileage may vary as to your own image. It may be your own street. It may be an Asian dwarf elephant. It may be a Dr. Seuss elephant. It could be anything. And that's what's curious about imagination, is we can't imagine something we don't know. So our memories deeply impact our imagination. Okay, memories get manipulated to some extent to build something new. And so that capacity, the more things that we have to refer to, the more we learn, the more we know, the more potentiality for creative connections we have. And so a piece of this, and the caveat there, is that, again, our memories are always incomplete. The news article that you read, you get drawn to certain parts of the news article, and when you share that with someone, you share between 2 and 95% of what you read in that article. Just like with this, you're going to remember somewhere between 2 and 95%. That's the big wide gap that they say, and it all depends on what you do with it. You walk out here and you try to teach somebody what you learned today, you're going to remember more. You have a conversation over lunch about it, you're going to remember more, and remember it for longer. You never think of it again, you're going to come back next week and go, what did we talk about last week? We have to use what we're learning for it to be retained, for it to be accessible for our imagination. teach it, share it, create a story about it. And the biggest thing is if we have an emotional experience related to a memory, what's been shown along the way is that memory lasts longer, it's more vivid, and we recall more of it faster. So when you have an epiphany, and we have those biblical images of Paul on the road to Emmaus, blinded. This huge epiphany about who God is and who Jesus was and what that means for his life. That's a vivid memory that shaped his identity and probably filled in with a healthy dose of imagination as well. But the idea here is that if we have an emotional experience, we're going to keep it for longer. This is why, to some extent, for many people, the pandemic has been a grieving and traumatic space. It's because it's been emotionally taxing for all of us. We will not forget. We will forget. And most days I forget the days of 2020. I won't forget the feeling of 2020 and what it felt like to be in a pandemic. And what I can do with that is imagine, should something like this happen again, how would I want to be or do or act differently? How would I want to respond differently? I can imagine, what does it mean when you're immunocompromised? What does it mean when you don't have the same accessibility to spaces that you depended on for connection? And empathize in that space. Imagination and empathy have a good bit of overlap. And so, I'm going to come back here to my thing here. So if you really love elephants, or the color purple, or have had a great experience on an electric scooter, you'll remember that image longer, recall it easier, and have a more vivid story around that space. We'd like to think of ourselves as rational creatures who get flustered by our emotions. The opposite is true. We're emotional creatures who sometimes think straight. A lot of this has to do with our autonomic system. So this is kind of the piece at the base of our brain back here. And the autonomic system is our fight or flight response. It's what prepares us for threats. And it's what makes us feel tense. It's what drains the blood from our face. It gives us digestive issues. It does all sorts of stuff to protect us. And emotions are the key to getting the autonomic system going. So we're primed to respond and react to our environments, not think our way through them. The thinking person's Neanderthal who wondered at the beauty of the saber-toothed tiger on the savannah usually didn't live long enough to procreate. It's the ones who ran away quickly and found ways to survive the threat that lived the longest. And so our bodies are primed to feel their way through the world. It's only recently with the Enlightenment and other things that we've tried to think of ourselves and think our way through the world. And these things work in concert with one another. There are ways of interrupting the autonomic system to access the prefrontal cortex so that we can respond rather than only react to our environments. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to some of the mental health and well-being stuff, how to do that. And so let's put it all together. I know for many of you, brain science is, not near as cool as I think it is. I've loved neuroscience for going on 10 years now, maybe 15. Just hopping into it and wondering, why in the world would God co-create, evolve, whatever this is that's in my head that makes me do these things. The fact is it's here, and the fact is it's built in certain ways, and it's built to respond to the environment, and it's built to imagine. It's built to be creative. It's built to find meaning. It's built to move toward connection. It is built not just to be there, but to become something. That's what neuroplasticity says. We are always becoming. It's never idle. There's some folks out there who say that it is the most inefficient organ ever created because it uses more energy than it produces. All the calories that we have to eat basically feed our brains and our brain's capacity to move the muscle and talk to the cell and do everything within there. It is so inefficient, and it is so amazing. Sometimes that extemporaneous stuff just gets you way off your notes. I don't know if you've ever felt that before, but this is that laid bare in public speaking moment where, I wish I was behind the lectern versus the out here in front. So, neuroplasticity, memory, emotions feed in together to help shape how we imagine. Okay? They impact our imaginations in a way that says that we can do new and hard things if we give ourselves permission to dream and wonder. And this is what's key, and this is what I found a lot when I worked with folks during the pandemic, is that they didn't want to give themselves permission to do or be something different. And so, if you need it, you have my permission to do and be something different, to become something new, to try something you've never tried. If you need permission, talk to somebody that you trust, a confidant, somebody who cares, somebody who's interested in not who you are, but who you are becoming, where you are going. Someone who wants to see you succeed. And lacking that, give yourself permission to be okay with not being the same you were yesterday, because you aren't, and you can't be. There's some research out there that says, I think it's either every 7 to 14 years, somewhere in between there, all of our cells become new. So if you've lived longer than 14, and I'm kind of looking out here and I'm seeing that most of us have, you are not the same physical being that you were when you were born. Quite literally. We are always renewing and remaking ourselves. And in this time, when we are emerging together, the capacity to renew, to reimagine, to re-engage is ripe for our imaginations. It's ripe for possibility. All right. I hesitate to do, I want to check my time here. I hesitate to do another one because you all don't have your papers. But I'll tell you what, put your name on this paper for a moment. We're going to do one more exercise here. And at the top of that page, write, I saw a purple elephant riding a scooter down the street. I saw a purple elephant riding a scooter down the street. And then below that, write, yes, and then I want you to fill in the blank with the next sentence of the story. So just write the next sentence of the story, whatever comes to mind. It doesn't matter. Yes. So it's I saw a purple elephant riding a scooter down the street. Yes, and then fill in the rest of that sentence. Or you can just write, and then the next portion of the story. And yes, you do have to change papers. All right, when you've done that, change your paper with someone. When you have a new sheet of paper in front of you, I want you to write, and then fill in the next sentence in the story. This is what happens when you sit up front. You know, nobody sits up front in the Presbyterian church, so you're left alone sometimes. And so once you've written your next sentence, what I want you to do is fold the paper so that the next person can only read your sentence. So fold it so that the top two sentences, I saw a purple elephant riding a scooter down the street, and the sentence after that are hidden from the person. And then exchange your paper one more time. And if you can remember where you got it, please give it back once you've written that last sentence. Somebody different. Somebody different. Yeah, if we can do somebody different. See, you're not going to remember anything I say today, but you're going to remember trying to find somebody to give a piece of paper to. All right, if you've written your final sentence, if you can find the person, if their name is on top of the paper and you can see who they are, give the paper back to them and let them unfurl it and read the story that the three of you have hopefully created together, because it's probably not the story they started out with. So the idea of improv, and these are just little improv exercises, are to take a moment and play, to take a moment and be creative. And as we're moving kind of to these final moments together, what we know about memory is that it needs a moment to kind of suck itself back in. And so when we're open and when we're learning something new, it's hard for us to remember what we're learning. But if we take a moment and pause by doing an exercise, by engaging with someone else, by sitting for a moment, what happens is the memory starts to form. Those neural pathways start to fire together a little bit more. If we're all the way open, everything is connecting, and so it's hard to know what to keep. And so again, you're welcome for being able to keep a purple elephant riding an electric scooter down the street. But the idea here is to engage the imagination, not just teach the imagination. All right, so 3 quotes, and I'm going to wind this down, and if we have any questions, happy to take them. So Einstein once said that imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited to all we know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand. Imagination is expansive. Maria Montessori once said that imagination will often carry us to worlds that never were, but without it, we go nowhere. And then Carl Sagan once remarked that I skipped those. That was Carl Sagan. Maria Montessori once said that imagination does not become great until human beings, given the courage and the strength, use it to create. So, these three quotes: knowledge, courage, and movement. This will be a waste of time, this whole series, if all we do is give you content. You can look up well-being, you can look up fitness, you can look up health online and find a myriad of sources that fit your particular context, that fit your particular biases. Knowledge is not enough in this quasi-weird pandemic thing that we're doing right now. It's not enough to know the public health measures, the research, the trends, the best practices. We have to be able to access our imaginations to see how things might play out. What do we imagine the message to be when our kids are required to wear masks, but the adults around them don't? What do we imagine the message to be to immunocompromised folks when we put all of our energy into coming back together in person, knowing full well they can't come? Imagination drives empathy. Our capacity to see beyond these armored brains and live into a relational world of faith and sacred stories. Imagination moves us to worlds unknown and takes us to places that help transform our relationships with ourselves, with God, and with others. Imagination is about co-creating new worlds out of old knowledge. Einstein knew that knowing is not enough to compel us to do. Otherwise, the world would already be a pretty doggone wonderful place. Only imagination can take us to what might be. And that takes courage, especially the courage to embrace the unknown and the possible. This is a time about being courageous with your imagination. What does your world look like when you're able to feel and experience a sense of well-being? What is different about you when you're in that state of well-being? And how do you interact differently with other people? What do I need to transform? And who do I need to ask for help in order to be that person who is well? I'll end with this. Filipina psychologist Annalise Inrail told this story about an experience with her cousin, who she describes as a screenwriter of telenovelas, dramedies, and other fabulousness. She once said to Annalise, "Why are you staring out into the ocean? You think the ideas will just come to you?" Before I could nod my sheepish admission to that yes, I was waiting for a muse. She laughed and said, "Even if your muse is coming, at least meet them halfway. We have to learn to create on our own." The past never comes back, and living there is nostalgia. The past, our memories, are the ripe fruit for our imagination and for dreaming about what is possible and what is next. I'm going to say what we all know, but we don't often admit. Normal is not returning. In fact, there was never a normal to begin with. There was habitual. And habitual is no way to go through life. As a people of faith, we are called into ritual, which requires our presence, our intention, and our imagination. It requires our capacity to dream, to wonder, to be creative and responsive to God's love and the new things laid out before us. What are your questions? What are your thoughts, aside from elephants and scooters and streets at this moment? We have a few minutes, I think, and would love to hear your wonderings. I'd love to know if anybody knows more than I do where I'm wrong, because that happens a lot. Comes with having teenage daughters. Yeah, come to the microphone so that we can get, but people at home might.
I think that sometimes we don't use our imaginations because we're afraid of what those around us will think if we are outside of the box.
Yeah. It is difficult, I imagine, to use your imagination and to share your imagination with others. This is why I think sometimes we uphold artists so much, is because we wish we could be them and do what they do. We wish that we could put whatever is in our heads and whatever it is that we're putting together out there for the world to see and have that courage. And fear is real. Our bodies, especially right now, so what we know with trauma, and there is a great deal of writing nowadays about how the world has experienced a collective trauma in this time. Trauma primes us to see what's wrong. It primes us to see threats. It primes us to be vigilant, to be binary in our thinking. Do I fight or do I run away? And so that capacity to be able to calm that part of our brain that impacts our bodies so deeply matters. And to find that moment of well-being, or those moments of well-being where we can say, you know what, I don't know if I can share this quite yet, but maybe I'll dip my toe in the water and share a little bit. Church should be a place of courageous theological imagination. My bias is that it should never be a place of habit. We come here with the intention of experiencing a living God, not a dead story. That's my imagination, at least. Other thoughts, things that are rabbit trailing for you. Yeah.
I have this image of an old kid's story of an alligator in his bedroom while his wife alligator is out creating this beautiful garden. But it's messy, and he doesn't want to be out there because everything in his room is just the way he wants it.
Yeah.
I have a toilet to fix at my home, and I'm I'm afraid to start it
Yeah.
because I don't think I'm very good at it.
Yeah.
I think water's going to go all over the bathroom. And so it's been sitting there for a week. I bought the parts from the hardware store, but I won't do it.
Yeah.
Help.
Thank you. I had a similar feeling to some extent, or set of feelings when I replaced the vanity in our bathroom. I had no idea what I was doing. It looked like the parts went in a certain way. And so, without the generous use of duct tape, but with the generous use of construction adhesive, or good stuff to glue it in place. I started one little thing at a time. It started with YouTube and plumbers, and learned what they learned so that I could imagine my hands doing what they're doing. And that took me a couple weeks as the sink kind of sat there to sit and to watch it. And at some point, I just had to say, I'm going to try. I'm just going to try. And it's not perfect. It's not even pretty now. It needs to be reset again a couple years later. But I was deathly afraid to even try for the longest time. We're in a space where everybody is trying something new. Every single person in here is doing something new because no one in here has ever lived through a pandemic. You'd have to be well into your hundreds to have survived and have knowledge of the 1918-ish influenza pandemic. No one has done this. And so grace matters. Compassion matters. Self-compassion matters. And imagination really matters. Because it's not that we have to. We get the opportunity to be something new, to do something new, to become something new. We get that privilege to do that. We don't have to do it. Something about, we don't talk about this much in the Presbyterian Church, but being Spirit-led. The Spirit speaking into the space. The Spirit is a voice of imagination, a voice of creativity, a voice of challenge, a voice of hope. The Spirit rarely came by and patted you on the head and said, "Good job." More than likely gave you a swift kick in the rear and said, "Get going." But know that you always go with God. You don't go alone. I don't know if that helps entirely, but one small step, one trusted partner, one confidant, one person that you can go to and say, "I don't know, but here's what I imagine." That will do wonders. You would be surprised. And we'll talk about that during the social part of this, what it means to be connected, and what it does to us physically when we're connected to other people. Looking at my time here, we're a little after 10:30, so I want to honor what needs to happen in here before what happens next. Feel free to reach out, to ask questions, to make comments if the microphone is not your place to do that. I'm here. I don't live far. And I'll be here next week. So if things from this week come to you during the week and you imagine a question, bring it next week and we'll talk about it. It's okay. You have my permission. This is all messy. All right. Blessings, folks. Peace be with you. Have a great week and imagine well.